What if the plants you've been ripping out of your garden, spraying with chemicals, and throwing into the compost were actually worth more per pound than the vegetables you buy at the grocery store? Not metaphorically, literally. Right now, people are paying 20, 30, sometimes even $50 a pound for plants that might already be growing in your lawn, along your driveway, or in the cracks of your sidewalk. Plants most gardeners call weeds. And here's the strange part. Many of these so-called weeds are nutritionally richer than the superfoods sold in expensive health stores. Some contain more minerals than spinach. Others have more omega-3 south than many cultivated crops. And a few have been used for centuries during wars, famines, and hard times to keep families alive. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what's the #1 food plant you wish you could grow in your own garden? Because today, you're going to discover 20 common weeds that are secretly powerful foods. Plants your grandparents or great-grandparents might have known, but modern gardening culture taught us to destroy. Some of these grow almost everywhere in temperate climates. Some are surprisingly delicious, and a few are so nutritionally dense that scientists are still studying them today. But stick with me until near the end, because one of the plants we'll talk about later is considered one of the most invasive weeds in the world. Governments spend millions trying to destroy it. Yet, it also happens to be one of the richest natural sources of a famous anti-aging compound used in expensive supplements. And another plant near the end. You probably fight it every spring in your lawn, while health stores sell it dried for up to $30 a pound. Once you see these plants differently, you may never look at a weed the same way again. Let's start with a simple truth most people never hear. A weed is often just a useful plant, whose value has been forgotten. For most of human history, people didn't have the luxury of ignoring wild plants. If crops failed, if winter ran long, if supply lines broke during war, people turned to what was growing around them. Wild greens, roadside herbs, and hardy plants that didn't need planting or care. These plants weren't considered weeds. They were survival food. During World War II, for example, millions of families in Europe relied on wild greens to stretch rationed food supplies. Older gardening books from the early 1900s mention harvesting plants from hedgerows and fields as completely normal. Your great-grandparents may have recognized dozens of edible plants without thinking twice. But something changed in the last century. Industrial agriculture, herbicides, and the idea of the perfectly manicured lawn slowly taught us that any plant we didn't intentionally plant must be a problem. So we sprayed them, pulled them, or poisoned entire fields to eliminate them. Meanwhile, something strange happened in the background. Scientists and nutrition researchers started analyzing these same plants and discovered that many of them were nutritional powerhouses. Some contained impressive mineral levels. Others had rare plant compounds studied for their health benefits. And several were already being sold quietly through herbal markets, supplement companies, and high-end restaurants. In other words, while homeowners were destroying them, other people were paying premium prices for them. And this is where the story gets interesting. Because the plants we're about to talk about don't require perfect soil, raised beds, irrigation systems, or expensive fertilizer, many of them grow almost anywhere. They tolerate neglect. They survive heat, drought, poor soil, and foot traffic. In other words, they're exactly the kind of plants that can keep producing food when gardens fail. In a moment, I'll show you one plant that farmers often consider a nuisance, yet its seeds contain oil levels that researchers believe could be useful both as food and even biofuel. And another sticky plant you've probably pulled out of your fence line without realizing herbalists have valued it for centuries. Let's start with the first one, a plant most people have never even heard of, but scientists are studying very closely. The first plant on our list is something most people would walk past without noticing. It's called field pennycris. In early spring, it appears in farm fields and disturbed soil, often before most crops even start growing. Farmers usually see it as a nuisance, just another weed to remove before planting real crops. But researchers have been studying this plant closely in recent years, and what they've discovered is surprisingly impressive. The seeds of field pennycris can contain around 30% oil by weight. That's an unusually high oil content for a wild plant. Scientists have been exploring its potential as both a cooking oil and even a possible biofuel crop. And because pennycris grows during the off-season, when farm fields might otherwise sit empty, agricultural researchers have studied whether it could be used as a cover crop that produces useful oil while protecting soil from erosion. But pennycris isn't only interesting. To researchers, the young leaves can be eaten as a wild green, though they have a strong flavor similar to mustard. In small amounts, they've been traditionally used like other members of the mustard family, added to salads or cooked as greens. One thing to remember though, flavor can vary widely depending on growing conditions. And like many wild plants in the mustard family, the taste can become bitter if the plant matures too much. Still, this humble little weed is one of the first edible greens to appear after winter in many climates, and that makes it valuable. When the ground is still cold, when most gardens are empty, plants like pennycris are already growing. Now the next plant is one you probably know very well, but not because you wanted it in your garden. In fact, many gardeners absolutely hate it because it sticks to everything. This plant is called cleavers. You might know it by nicknames like sticky weed, goosegrass, or sticky willy. If you've ever brushed against it while walking through tall grass, you know exactly what it does. Tiny hooked hairs cover the stems and leaves, letting the plant cling to clothing, animal fur, or anything that passes by. It's nature's version of Velcro. But those sticky little hooks are only part of the story. For centuries, herbal traditions across Europe used cleavers as a spring tonic plant. Herbalists believed it supported the lymphatic system, the part of the body involved in fluid balance and immune response. Today, modern herbalists still use cleavers in traditional preparations, usually as a cold infusion made from fresh plants. That means steeping the plant in cool water rather than hot, because heat can damage some of the delicate plant compounds. The resulting drink is mild and grassy in flavor. Of course, if you ever experiment with wild plants for food or herbal use. It's important to properly identify them and consult reliable local guides or experts. Misidentification can be dangerous with wild plants, but cleavers is one of those plants that grows everywhere in spring, climbing fences, scrambling through hedges, and quietly producing armfuls of edible greenery most people simply throw away. Now the next plant might surprise you even more, because this little roadside weed has a history going back thousands of years and has been used in traditional medicine across multiple cultures. And once you notice its tiny heart-shaped seed pods, you'll start seeing it almost everywhere. That plant is called shepherd's purse, and once you learn to recognize it, you'll probably start spotting it everywhere, growing in sidewalk cracks, parking lots, roadsides, and bare soil. The name comes from its tiny seed pods. Each one is shaped like a small heart or triangular purse. In the past, people thought they looked like the small leather pouches shepherds carried for coins. It may look ordinary, but historically, shepherd's purse has been one of the most widely used medicinal herbs across Europe and Asia. Traditional herbal texts describe it being used for centuries to help manage bleeding and circulation-related issues. Historical accounts mention its use by midwives and even battlefield medics in earlier centuries. Modern research has begun examining some of the compounds found in the plant, and studies suggest it does contain biologically active substances that may influence blood vessel contraction and circulation. However, like many traditional herbs, medical use should never replace professional health care advice. Anyone considering herbal remedies should always consult qualified medical professionals. But as a food plant, shepherd's purse has also been used traditionally in several cultures. In parts of Asia, especially in Chinese cuisine, the young leaves are sometimes cooked and used in dumplings or stir-fries. And like many early spring greens, the best time to harvest is when the leaves are young and tender. The plant grows quickly and completes its life cycle fast, which is why it spreads so easily in disturbed soil. Now here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. The next plant on our list isn't just edible. It's actually the wild ancestor of one of the most common vegetables in your kitchen. In fact, every carrot you've ever eaten can trace its history back to this wild roadside plant. But there's also a very serious warning attached to it, because this plant has deadly lookalikes. And if you don't know exactly what you're doing, it's one that should never be harvested. So in the next part, we'll talk about the beautiful white wildflower that gave us the modern carrot, and the extremely dangerous plant it's often confused with. And later, we'll also get into one of the most mineral-rich weeds in the world, a plant many gardeners try to eliminate that could actually feed you for decades. But first, if this video is helping you see your garden differently, tap the like button. It helps more people discover that some of the most useful plants on Earth might already be growing under their feet. The next plant is one of the most beautiful wildflowers growing along roadsides and open fields. You've probably seen its delicate white flower clusters swaying in summer breezes. It's called Queen Anne's lace, and it's actually the wild ancestor of the modern carrot. Thousands of years ago, people began selecting and cultivating this wild plant for its root. Over generations, Those roots slowly became larger, sweeter, and more colorful, eventually giving us the orange carrots we know today. In its wild form, however, the root is much smaller and tougher. It still has that familiar carrot-like scent when crushed, which is one of the clues for identifying it. But here's the important warning. Queen Anne's lace has several deadly lookalikes, most notably poison hemlock, one of the most toxic plants in North America and Europe. Even small amounts of poison hemlock can be fatal if ingested. Because of this risk, experts strongly recommend that beginners never harvest Queen Anne's lace unless they are absolutely certain of identification and have experience with plant foraging. The real plant usually has hairy stems and often a tiny purple flower. In the center of the white cluster, though not always, poison hemlock typically has smooth stems with purple blotches. Still, when there is any doubt at all, the safest rule in foraging is simple. Leave it alone. Wild plants deserve respect, and careful identification is always the first step. But when identified correctly, Queen Anne's lace tells a fascinating story about how many of our modern crops began as humble wild plants. The vegetables in your garden today were once weeds themselves. Now the next plant is something farmers and gardeners often consider extremely stubborn. It has a deep taproot pull at once, and it often grows right back. And that's because the root can extend deep into the soil, drawing up minerals other plants can't reach. This plant is called yellow dock. If you've ever walked through an old field or pasture, you've probably seen it. Tall stems with clusters of rusty brown seeds waving in the wind. For centuries, herbal traditions valued the root of yellow dock. One reason is that the plant contains naturally occurring iron along with compounds that stimulate digestion. Herbalists often described it as a plant that supports both nutrient absorption and gentle digestive function. But beyond herbal traditions, yellow dock also has an interesting ecological role. Because of its deep taproot, it can help break up compacted soil and pull nutrients closer to the surface, something that benefits surrounding plants. However, like many wild greens, parts of the plant contain oxalic acid. That's the same compound found in spinach and rhubarb. For most people, moderate amounts are fine as part of a varied diet. But individuals with certain medical conditions, like kidney stone issues, may need to limit foods high in oxalates. As always, understanding both benefits and limitations is important when dealing with wild foods. Now the next plant is closely related to yellow dock, and it might be one of the easiest wild greens to cook. In fact, in parts of Eastern Europe and traditional rural cuisines, it's been used in soups, pies, and sautéed dishes for generations. And if you've ever walked along a roadside ditch in spring, there's a good chance you've seen it growing by the thousands.